Ethan had always liked the idea of living quietly, away from drama. He had bought his house in a sunny part of town, not only because it was peaceful, but also because the roof was perfect for solar panels. 2 years earlier, he had invested almost all his savings into a state-of-the-art solar energy system. The panels on his roof glistened under the bright sun, and each day they produced more energy than he needed. It wasn't just about saving money. Ethan liked knowing he was independent. The extra electricity went back into the city's grid, and he received a small payment every month. It made him proud. His neighbors mostly left him alone. There was an HOA, the homeowners association, but his street was on the edge of the neighborhood. Technically, his property wasn't under their control, which he thought was a blessing. He had heard stories of people being fined for painting their doors the wrong shade of blue or planting the wrong kind of flowers. Ethan had no interest in those petty rules. One bright Tuesday afternoon, he came home from work and saw something strange. There was a red Tesla parked in his driveway. It wasn't just parked there. The charging cable from his outdoor outlet was plugged into it. Ethan slowed his walk, wondering if he was seeing things. He didn't own a Tesla, and none of his close friends did either. He walked closer and saw a woman standing near the car, looking at her phone. She glanced up at him and waved like it was the most normal thing in the world. It took Ethan a second to place her face. This was Karen, the infamous HOA Karen people whispered about. She lived about 6 houses down in a big white house with a perfect lawn. Ethan had met her only once, years ago, when she had stopped him to comment on how different his garden looked compared to others. She was the kind of person who always seemed to be watching everyone else's business. "Hi," Ethan said slowly. "Oh, hey Ethan, right?" she replied cheerfully, as if they were old friends. "I just needed to top up my car. I figured it's fine since you've got those panels up there." She pointed at his roof as though that explained everything. Ethan blinked, unsure how to respond. "You're charging your car from my outlet?" She smiled like she had just been caught borrowing a pen. "Yeah, but it's just sunlight, you know. It's free. You're not paying for it." Ethan felt a small twist of irritation in his chest. Yes, the sunlight was free, but the equipment wasn't. He had paid thousands for the panels and still had to maintain them. Plus, that electricity could have been stored in his battery or sold back to the grid. It wasn't just lying around waiting for her to take. Still, he didn't want to make a scene. "Well, I guess it's fine this once," he said, trying to sound polite. "But in the future—" "Oh, thanks. You're a lifesaver," Karen interrupted, not even letting him finish. She climbed into her Tesla and started the engine. "I'll just unplug in a minute when it's done." She went back to scrolling on her phone. Ethan stood there for a moment, unsure if he should push the issue or just walk inside. He decided to let it go. Maybe she was in a bind. Maybe her home charger was broken. Surely she wouldn't make a habit of it. The next morning, Ethan left early for work. When he came home in the evening, the driveway was empty. He didn't think much of it until 2 days later, when he pulled in after work and saw the red Tesla there again, plugged into his outlet. This time Karen wasn't around. The car was charging by itself, the thick black cable dangling from his wall. He frowned and unplugged it. Coiling the cable neatly on its hook, the pattern continued. Every few days, the Tesla appeared, feeding off his power like some mechanical leech. Once, when he came home earlier than usual, he caught her sitting in the driver's seat, reading a magazine while the car charged. She greeted him casually, almost like she was visiting her own property. Ethan tried to be understanding. Maybe she was genuinely struggling. But the truth was, it was starting to bother him. His battery reports showed unusual drops in stored energy. He couldn't sell as much electricity back to the grid, which meant less income. It wasn't a lot of money, but it was his money. One Saturday morning, he was in his living room, sipping coffee, when he heard the faint hum of the Tesla. Outside, curious, he stepped out. Karen was standing next to the car, chatting loudly on her phone, one hand resting on the charging port. She didn't even acknowledge him until she finished her call. "Morning," she said brightly. "I hope you don't mind. I have a long trip today, so I need a full charge." Ethan stared at her. "Karen, this is my private outlet. Can't." "Oh, come on," she said with a laugh. "You've got free energy falling from the sky. I'm just borrowing a bit. We're neighbors, right?" Her tone made it sound like he was the one being unreasonable. Ethan wanted to argue, but she turned back to her car, clearly ending the conversation. That afternoon, he went inside and checked his security camera footage. Sure enough, there were multiple clips of her pulling into his driveway, plugging in, and leaving the car for hours. Some days she came twice. Ethan realized this wasn't a one-time neighborly favor. This was theft wrapped up in a smile and a wave, and if he didn't stop it soon, she'd keep doing it. But what really unsettled him was the way she acted so casual about it, as if she owned the right to his property just because they lived in the same area. That smile, that airy wave, it was the kind of thing that told him she'd already decided he was too polite to say no. He finished his coffee, staring out at the panels glinting in the sun. He had worked hard for those panels. He had done the math, planned the layout, signed the contracts, and climbed onto the roof himself to inspect every piece. And now, without even asking, someone else was enjoying the benefits while he footed the bill. The first time he saw that Tesla, he had been surprised. Now he was just getting angry. And deep down he had a feeling that if he didn't act, this just borrowing a bit would turn into a full-time habit. The next few days were tense for Ethan. Every time he left for work, he wondered if he'd come home to find that familiar red Tesla in his driveway again. It wasn't just the electricity anymore. It was the principle. His home was supposed to be his space, his safe zone. But somehow Karen had decided it was her charging station. Ethan tried to push the thought aside. But the more he looked at his energy reports, the more annoyed he became. His solar system kept detailed records of how much electricity was being produced and used. Normally, his daily usage was consistent, but lately, there were sudden spikes, big chunks of power disappearing in just a couple of hours. He didn't need to be an engineer to figure out what that meant. Tesla battery wasn't small. They could drain a lot of power fast. He decided it was time to have a conversation. He didn't want to yell or cause a scene, but he needed to make it clear that this wasn't okay. One evening, just as the sun was setting, Ethan spotted the Tesla in his driveway again. He took a deep breath, stepped outside, and walked up to it. Karen was already there, leaning against the car with her arms crossed, scrolling through her phone. She looked up when she saw him, her face lighting up with the same overly cheerful smile she always wore. "Hey there," she said as if she'd been waiting for him. Ethan began slowly. "I need to talk to you about this." He gestured toward the charging cable plugged into his outlet. She tilted her head, feigning confusion. "About what this?" he repeated firmly. "Charging your car here? You've been using my electricity. I didn't agree to this." Karen let out a short laugh, as though the whole thing was amusing. "Oh, come on, Ethan. You've got solar panels. It's free energy. You're not losing anything." "That's not true," Ethan said, keeping his voice calm. "It might be free sunlight, but my equipment isn't free. My battery storage isn't unlimited. When you use this power, I can't store as much for myself or sell it back to the grid. It costs me money." She rolled her eyes dramatically, as if he were making a big deal over nothing. "Seriously? We're neighbors? Shouldn't we help each other out? I'm not asking you to pay for my car. I'm just using something you have plenty of." "That's not how it works," Ethan replied. "It's my property, my system, and you didn't ask. Can't just show up and plug in." Her smile dropped a little, replaced by a hint of irritation. "You know, as a member of the HOA board, I could point out that we all benefit from sharing resources. Now, some communities actually require it." Ethan's eyebrows shot up. "Oh, I'm not part of the HOA. My property isn't under your rules." Karen crossed her arms. "Maybe not officially, but we're all part of the same neighborhood. And I think you're being selfish." That word selfish made Ethan want to laugh out loud. The irony was too much. But instead of laughing, he forced himself to keep his voice steady. "Karen, I'm asking you politely. Please stop charging your car here." She gave him a long look, then shrugged as if the conversation were already over. "Fine. I'll finish up and move it." "I think you're overreacting." Ethan went back inside, feeling like the talk hadn't done much. Sure enough, the next morning, when he checked his mailbox, there was a letter from the HOA. It was printed on official letterhead and worded in that It's a polite but bossy way HOAs always seem to use. It read, "Dear homeowner, in the interest of promoting community spirit and environmental responsibility, the HOA encourages residents to share their renewable energy resources with neighbors in need. Cooperation ensures that our neighborhood remains sustainable and united." Ethan didn't need to guess who had written that. The tone, the timing, it had Karen written all over it. She had clearly gone straight to the HOA after their conversation. Trying to put social pressure on him, he tossed the letter onto his kitchen counter and stared at it for a while. The nerve of her. It wasn't just that she was taking his electricity. Now she was trying to make it seem like he was obligated to give it to her. That week, Ethan made a point of coming home at different times, hoping to catch her in the act again, and he did. On Thursday afternoon, he pulled into the driveway at 3:15 p.m., and there she was, Tesla parked, cable plugged in, trunk open with grocery bags inside. She was nowhere to be seen. Probably inside her own house, or visiting another neighbor, while her car filled up on his dime. Ethan unplugged the cable and set it on the ground. Then he waited. 10 minutes later, Karen came back, carrying a shopping bag. She stopped in her tracks when she saw him standing there. "Oh," she said, her voice a little too casual. "I thought you weren't home yet. I switched shifts." "Today," Ethan replied evenly. "And I told you, no more charging here." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "This is ridiculous, Ethan. Do you realize how small-minded you sound? It's a few kilowatts of power. You're acting like I'm stealing gold from your safe." "It's still stealing," he said firmly. "I don't care if it's power, water, or a loaf of bread. You take something without permission, it's stealing." Karen gave a sharp laugh, the kind that was meant to dismiss the other person's point without actually addressing it. "Fine, whatever. I'll move the car." She yanked the cable out, threw it into the back seat, and got in without another word. As she backed out, she rolled her window down just enough to say, "You know, most neighbors try to get along. You might want to think about that." Then she sped off. Ethan watched her taillights disappear and felt a mix of frustration and disbelief. He had been more than polite. He had even given her the benefit of the doubt the first couple of times. But she clearly didn't care about boundaries. That night, he checked his security cameras again. Over the last month, she had come by at least 9 times, always during the day when he was gone. The footage was undeniable, and he decided then and there that he was going to start saving every clip. She tried anything again, he would have proof. But deep down, Ethan had a sinking feeling. People like Karen didn't just stop because someone asked nicely. She had already shown that she thought she was entitled to his power. And if the HOA was willing to send letters hinting he should share it, she might think she had the upper hand. Ethan leaned back in his chair, staring at the glow from his computer screen. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Was starting to think that if Karen wanted to play games, he might just have to play back. After the last confrontation, Ethan hoped Karen might have taken his words seriously. He even gave it a week before checking his camera footage, thinking maybe, just maybe, she would stay away. But when he finally reviewed the recordings, he found she hadn't slowed down at all. In fact, she seemed to be charging her Tesla more often at first. It was once every 3 or 4 days. Then it was almost daily. Sometimes she would come in the late morning, leave the Tesla plugged in for hours, and return just before he got home from work. Other times she'd show up in the early evening, using the fading daylight to top off her battery. She was clearly watching his schedule, timing her visits for when she knew he'd be gone. One Monday, Ethan came home unexpectedly early. His meeting at work had been canceled, so he decided to take the afternoon off. He turned onto his street, and sure enough, there was the red Tesla in his driveway, this time blocking his garage door completely. His stomach tightened. He pulled in behind her car, got out, and walked toward the charging port. Karen was sitting inside the Tesla, leaning back with her sunglasses on and sipping from a stainless steel coffee cup. She didn't even flinch when he approached. "You're blocking my garage," Ethan said flatly. She took off her sunglasses slowly, looking at him with mild surprise. "Oh, hey, didn't think you'd be home so soon." "Ah, snap," Ethan replied. You're in my driveway. You're charging without permission. You're blocking me from getting my own car out. Karen glanced at the garage door and then back at him. You weren't going anywhere, were you? That's not the issue, Ethan said, his patience thinning. Move the car. She sighed heavily, as if he were asking her to do something outrageous. You know, I'm starting to feel like you're making a huge fuss over nothing. It's just power, Ethan, and you've got enough for the whole street. That's not for you to decide, he said, stepping toward the charging. Cabled, her tone sharpened. Don't touch my car. Ethan froze for a moment, jaw tightening. He didn't want to start a physical confrontation, but his temper was burning. Move it, he repeated, this time with less patience in his voice. Karen stared at him for a long second before finally putting the Tesla into reverse. As she backed out, she called through the open window, "You should really think about being a better neighbor." Then she drove away without even unplugging the cable properly, and dragged along the driveway until it popped out of the car's port and clattered against the ground. Ethan bent down, picked it up, and wound it back onto its hook. The connector was scratched. A small bit of damage was all it took to tip his frustration into something sharper. That evening, he ordered a locking outlet cover from an online store. It arrived 2 days later, and he installed it right away. The clear plastic cover snapped over the outlet and could only be opened with a key. He felt a small sense of relief finally, something that might put an end to the nonsense. But the relief didn't last. The following week, Ethan came home to find the cover lying in the grass beside his driveway. The screws had been removed neatly, as though someone had taken their time with it. And of course, the Tesla had been there again, the camera showed. Karen arriving mid-morning, removing the cover, charging her car for 2 hours, and leaving. He watched the footage twice, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. It wasn't just about electricity anymore. She had come onto his property, tampered with his things, and acted like it was her right to do so. The next time he saw her at the grocery store, she walked past him without a word, but the smug look on her face said everything. She knew she could get away with it, and she was enjoying the game. Ethan decided it was time to start documenting everything. He set up his cameras to record higher quality video and added a second camera pointing directly at the outlet. He also began keeping a log of dates and times she showed up, along with estimated amounts of power she used. The numbers weren't small. Charging a Tesla wasn't like charging a phone. Over the past month, she had taken enough electricity to power his entire house for several days. Then came the worst day yet. Ethan woke up early on a Saturday and noticed the driveway was wet, even though it hadn't rained. When he stepped outside, he realized it wasn't water. It was a thin trail of spilled coffee leading from the street to the outlet. On the security footage, he saw Karen pulling into his driveway at 6:30 a.m., charging her Tesla, and then spilling her drink as she fumbled with her phone. She didn't bother cleaning it up. That morning, Ethan sent her a text. He didn't have her number saved, but she had once given it to him during a neighborhood block party years ago. Ethan, Karen, stop charging your car at my house. This is the last warning. Her reply came 5 minutes later. Karen, you're being ridiculous. It's renewable energy. You can't claim ownership of sunlight. Ethan didn't even respond. There was no point arguing with someone who refused to understand the concept of private property. What really made him angry was that she seemed to be encouraging others. One afternoon, while Ethan was home, he saw her standing with 2 other neighbors by her Tesla. She was pointing toward his house and saying something that made them laugh. He couldn't hear the words, but the meaning was obvious. She was probably telling them how she borrowed his power whenever she wanted. It wasn't long before his suspicion was confirmed. One morning, his cameras caught not just Karen, but another car, this time a silver Nissan Leaf, pulling into his driveway and plugging into his outlet. He didn't even know who the owner was. That was the moment Ethan knew things had gone too far. If she was telling other people they could help themselves, soon his driveway would become the neighborhood charging station. He sat down that night with a notebook, listing his options. He could go to the police, but he doubted they'd treat it as anything more than a civil matter. He could confront the HOA, but given the letter they'd sent, they might actually side with her. He could keep installing locks. She had already proven she wasn't afraid to tamper with them. The more he thought about it, the more he realized he needed a different approach, something that didn't just block her, but made her lose interest. Entirely. She had to feel the inconvenience herself, not just hear him complain about it. That's when an idea began to take shape. He didn't want to damage her car that would be crossing a line, but maybe there was a way to make charging from his outlet more trouble than it was worth. He started reading through the manual for his solar system, digging into online forums. For solar owners and electricians, that's when he discovered a small, technical detail about his inverter system that made him smile for the first time in weeks. It was possible, under certain maintenance settings, to temporarily adjust the voltage output from the solar panels. Normally, everything ran at a standard safe level. But in test mode, the voltage could be increased, still within legal safety limits for a house, but high enough to cause sensitive charging systems, like those in electric cars, to shut off. Automatically to protect themselves, Ethan sat back in his chair, staring at the screen. He didn't know if it would work yet, but the thought of Karen plugging in and being met with nothing but error messages was incredibly satisfying. It wouldn't damage her car. It wouldn't break any laws. But it might just annoy her enough. To make her stop coming altogether, he closed his laptop and leaned back, already starting to plan how he could make it happen without her knowing. Ethan didn't jump into his plan right away. He wanted to be careful, make sure everything would work exactly as he imagined. The last thing he wanted was for Karen to have any real damage to her car that could give her an excuse to come after him legally. He wasn't looking to break anything. He just wanted to make her life inconvenient enough that she'd think twice before ever plugging into his outlet again. For the next few nights, after dinner, he sat at his kitchen table with his laptop, open, reading manuals, technical support threads, and solar owner forums. He learned about how his inverter, the device that converted the solar panel energy into usable electricity, had a maintenance mode. This mode allowed voltage testing at slightly higher levels than normal. It wasn't dangerous for a normal household appliance like a fridge or lamp, but modern electric cars had sensitive charging systems that would automatically stop charging if the voltage didn't match their safe range. He found posts from other people who had experienced similar issues when their home systems were misconfigured. One even mentioned how their Tesla would immediately cut off charging and display an error message saying, "Charging interrupted. Check power source." That was exactly the kind of harmless roadblock Ethan needed. The plan started forming in his head. He'd set up a hidden switch in his living room that, when flipped, would activate the inverter's test mode for the outlet Karen used. That way, he could wait until she was mid-charge and then trigger the higher voltage. Her car would stop, charging instantly, and she'd probably assume something was wrong with her own equipment or the cable. But before doing anything, Ethan decided to test it. One Saturday afternoon, he plugged in his own small electric scooter to the outlet. He flipped the inverter to test mode. The scooter's charger immediately shut off just as he expected. He flipped the switch back, and it started charging again. Without any issues, perfect. Next, he had to make sure Karen wouldn't figure out he was doing it on purpose. He installed the small toggle switch inside a decorative wooden box that sat on his living room shelf. To anyone else, it looked like a little souvenir box, the kind you might bring home from a vacation. But inside, hidden behind a small piece of felt, was the switch connected to the inverter's control wire. Now all he needed was the right opportunity. He didn't have to wait long. 3 days later, Ethan was working from home. Around 11 a.m., he heard the faint sound of tires on gravel. He glanced at his security camera feed on his phone. There it was, the shiny red Tesla pulling into his driveway like it belonged there. Karen stepped out, her sunglasses perched on top of her head, holding the charging cable like she'd done it 100 times before. She plugged in, tapped her phone screen, and walked away, leaving the car humming as it pulled in power. Ethan watched the minutes tick by on his phone. He wanted her to get comfortable first, let her think she was getting exactly what she wanted. After about 10 minutes, when he was sure she'd gone home or to run errands, he walked casually to the shelf, opened the little box, and flipped the switch. In an instant, the outlet changed its output. Inverter's test mode kicked in. raising the voltage just enough to trip the Tesla's safety system. Out in the driveway, there was a faint click, followed by silence. Ethan switched to the driveway camera feed and smiled. The Tesla's charging light had gone from green to dark, and a bright warning had popped up on its dashboard screen. A minute later, Karen reappeared. She was holding a reusable grocery bag and looked confused when she saw the charging had stopped. She bent down, fiddled with the connector, unplugged it, and plugged it back in. The car beeped, started charging for 2 seconds, then stopped again. Another error flashed. Ethan almost laughed out loud but kept his composure. He wanted to watch the whole show. Karen tried again, this time wiping the connector with the edge of her shirt as if dust might be the problem. She plugged it in slowly, carefully. The car hummed briefly, then clicks stopped once more. Frowned, looked around as though the driveway itself might offer answers, then pulled out her phone. Ethan guessed she was checking Tesla's troubleshooting app. After a couple of minutes, she tried a different tactic. She moved the cable to the other side of the driveway where there was a second outlet, one Ethan rarely used. What she didn't know was that outlet was connected to the same system, and therefore the same test mode voltage. The same thing happened. Beep! Click. Error. Buy now. Karen's face had gone from confused to annoyed. She put her hands on her hips, staring at the car like it had betrayed her. She tried one last time, holding the cable in place, as though sheer determination could force it to work. But after the third failure, she yanked the plug out entirely and tossed it back toward the wall. She stood there for a moment, looking around as though wondering if any neighbors were watching. Then she got into the Tesla, started it up, and backed out of the driveway with more speed than necessary. Ethan flipped the switch back to normal, just in case she returned later that day. But she didn't. Though she was back, Ethan was ready. This time, she didn't even get 10 minutes in before he activated test mode. So once again, the Tesla's charging system failed. This time, she stayed in the car, staring at the dashboard screen for a long time before shaking her head and driving off. By the third time it happened, her reaction was almost funny. She plugged in, waited, saw the error, and immediately groaned out loud. Ethan could hear her through the slightly open living room window. She muttered something he couldn't quite catch, then unplugged and left without even trying a second. Ethan could almost feel the frustration radiating from her. To her, this must have seemed like an unpredictable technical problem, something she couldn't solve. And that didn't happen anywhere else except at his outlet, and that was the beauty of it. He wasn't confronting her, wasn't yelling, or threatening. He was just making it inconvenient enough that she'd stop on her own. By the end of the week, the visits had stopped entirely. For the first time in months, Ethan's driveway stayed empty during the day. His energy reports went back to normal. His battery stayed full, and the extra power he generated went right back into the grid, earning him the credits he was supposed to get. Still, he kept the switch installed, just in case. One Friday evening, while Ethan was watering his front lawn, Karen walked past with her dog. She didn't look at him at first, but after a few steps, she turned her head slightly and said, "You should probably get that outlet checked. It's been acting weird." Ethan smiled politely. "Oh, works fine for me?" She opened her mouth, as if to say something else, then thought better of it. Without another word, she walked on. Ethan went back to watering, hiding his grin. The plan had worked perfectly. It was almost 2 weeks since Karen had last tried to charge her Tesla at Ethan's house. The sudden peace felt strange but welcome. No unexpected cars blocking his garage. No extra drain on his solar system. No more feeling like someone was trespassing on his property whenever he wasn't home. But peace with Karen was never permanent. Ethan knew her type, someone who couldn't stand losing, someone who would rather stir up trouble than admit she was wrong. He had been waiting for the other shoe to drop, and it finally did on a sunny Wednesday afternoon. He was coming back from running errands. When he saw Karen walking up his driveway with a folded piece of paper in her hand, her face was tight, her jaw set. She stopped halfway when she saw him get out of his car. "We need to talk," she said, her voice sharp. Ethan shut his door calmly. "About what?" She held out the paper. "About this?" You damaged my car? He didn't take the paper right away? Damaged? I don't think so. Her eyes narrowed. Every time I've tried to charge here lately, my Tesla's been acting up. The charging port is malfunctioning. The dealership says there's been irregular voltage going into the system. You've been messing with it. Ethan almost laughed at how quickly she had jumped from borrowing his power without permission to accusing him of breaking her car. Instead, he just said, I haven't damaged anything. Your car stops charging when something's wrong with the source, right? It's a safety feature. It protects your car. Her lips pressed into a thin line. So you admit there's something wrong with your outlet? He took a step closer, keeping his tone calm. Karen, my outlet works perfectly. In fact, I have security footage from every single time you've charged here without my permission. I might add. And I can show you proof that my system is safe and fully functional. That made her hesitate. Security footage? Ethan smiled faintly. Of course. Cameras cover the whole driveway. Want to see the clips? I show you plugging in, charging for hours, even removing my outlet lock. Her face flushed a little, though she quickly tried to cover it with a scoff. Those locks are against HOA safety codes. Not on my property, Ethan said. I'm not under the HOA, and since you mentioned them, maybe we should have. This conversation with the HOA board. That way everyone can hear about how often you've been helping yourself to my electricity. That made her shift uncomfortably. That's not what this is about. I just want you to take responsibility, Ethan. Cut her off. Responsibility for what? For keeping my property safe? For not letting someone steal from me? Because that's exactly what's been happening here. She opened her mouth to argue again, but Ethan reached into his bag and pulled out a small folder. Inside were printed still images from his security footage, each one time-stamped, showing her car in his driveway and her handling the cable. He held them out. These, he said evenly, show every time you've been here without asking. And this, he continued, pulling out another sheet, is an estimate of how much electricity you've taken. I've calculated the kilowatters and the going rate. This is the amount you've cost me. Karen's eyes darted over the paper, but she didn't take it. This is ridiculous. I'm not paying you for sunlight. Ethan stayed calm. You don't have to pay me. But if it happens again, I'll take this folder to the police. I'll send a copy to the HOA so they know exactly what kind of behavior you've been encouraging. Her expression changed. That last part had hit home. She probably didn't want the board or the rest of the neighborhood to know she'd been caught on camera stealing power. You wouldn't do that, she said. But there wasn't much confidence in her voice. Ethan looked her in the eye. Try me. For a long moment, they stood there, the only sound being the faint hum of an air conditioner from somewhere down the street. Finally, Karen huffed and stepped back. Fine, you're impossible. I won't come here again. But you should know. People talk. This kind of behavior gets around. Ethan smiled slightly. Good, make sure everyone knows I don't let people steal from me. She glared at him for a second longer, then turned on her heel and walked away. Her dog, which had been sitting patiently on the sidewalk, trotted along beside her. Ethan watched her go, then carried the folder inside. He didn't expect her to apologize. That wasn't her style, but he knew she wouldn't risk getting caught again. She had tried to intimidate him and lost. That was the kind of defeat people like Karen remembered for a long time. Sure enough, weeks passed without a single sign of her Tesla in his driveway. His energy usage stayed consistent, his battery stayed full, and his credits from the utility company returned to normal. Life felt peaceful again, but the story didn't end completely there. 1 month later, Ethan attended a neighborhood meeting, not an HOA meeting, but a community safety night hosted at the local park. People were talking about crime prevention, sharing tips on how to keep their homes secure. When the conversation turned to installing cameras, Ethan mentioned that his security system had saved him from a neighbor who thought my property was a free charging station. A few people laughed, but a few others glanced around curiously, clearly wondering who he meant. He didn't name names, but it didn't take long for the details to spread. By the end of the week, Ethan noticed that Karen wasn't stopping to chat with anyone in front of their houses anymore. She walked her dog quickly, kept her head down, and avoided lingering near other people's driveways. Ethan never intended to embarrass her. but he couldn't help feeling a little satisfaction. Actions had consequences, and this time she'd had to face them. He kept the small toggle switch in his living room hidden inside the decorative box, even though he hadn't needed it since the last confrontation. It was a comforting little reminder that he could take control of his own space without breaking any laws or lowering himself to her level. Sometimes, when he passed the shelf, he'd glance at it and smile to himself. And as for Karen's Tesla, it was now always parked in her own driveway, plugged into a shiny new home charging station she had probably paid a lot for. Every time he drove past her house and saw it there, he couldn't help but think how different things might have been if she'd simply asked in the first place. Instead, she'd tried to take, to push, to bully, and ended up with nothing. Ethan went back to enjoying his quiet life, his efficient solar panels, and the small pleasure of knowing he had handled the problem in his own clever way. The sun kept shining, the panels kept humming, and his driveway stayed blissfully empty. For the first time in months, truly felt like his home again.